Hey guys, tonight we're plunging headfirst into a world of moaning, murmured prayers and the occasional burning at the stake. We're talking about sex in medieval Europe, and fair warning, you probably won't survive this. Literally. If you're a peasant, childbirth alone could kill you, and if not that, there's always the risk of leprosy, the Inquisition, or a jealous noble with a sword. But you're here now, and since there's no turning back, welcome. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And tell me, what city are you watching from, and what time is it? Always curious to know how late y'all are staying up for this. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You open your eyes and take your first breath in a one-room cottage that smells faintly of wet straw, smoke, and something you later learn is boiled turnip surprise. You're born into the 13th century somewhere in rural France, or maybe Saxony or England. It's all mud and sheep and yelling right now. But from the very start, your body isn't really yours. It's a sin sponge. Your every twitch, itch, and growing desire is watched not just by your parents or your village priest, but allegedly by God himself. Lucky you. By the time you can walk, you're hearing sermons that boil your anatomy down to two basic facts. It's shameful, and it will betray you. Lust is a cardinal sin, and the devil conveniently loves hiding in warm places, like between your legs. The church doesn't just discourage sexual pleasure, it actively fears it. Why? Because they believe it short-circuits reason. Your soul, they say, rides atop your body like a nobleman on a horse, but if the horse bolts toward temptation, the rider is going down. Still, the horse is frisky. People are people, and no amount of sermons or Latin scoldings can erase the basic drive to get naked with someone else. The tension between human instincts and spiritual ideals plays out every day, in marriages, in monasteries, even in art. Spoiler. Despite the heavy religious messaging, people are still having sex, and not always the kind that gets you a clean conscience or a baby. Now, let's say you grow up a little. You're maybe 11 or 12, and you're beginning to feel things. Your village priest says that lust leads to hell, but then there's Marjorie, the flaxen-haired baker's daughter, who once smiled at you when you tripped over a goose, and suddenly you're praying way more often, but it's not working. Not really. You're told to repress, that's the answer. Cold baths, fasting, long walks while reciting psalms, anything but actually dealing with your desires. This isn't just personal discipline, it's church doctrine. Celibacy, especially for clergy, is considered a form of spiritual purification, a way to rise above the animal. But in reality, a good chunk of priests are hooking up with housekeepers, confessing it later, and being forgiven, sometimes for a small fee. Sex is framed like a necessary evil. Its only sanctioned purpose is procreation, and even then only within marriage. Pleasure, that's suspicious. Moaning, downright heretical. Anything beyond the basic missionary was often labelled unnatural, though we'll dive into that delightful rabbit hole later. For now, know this. Your role as a sexual being in medieval Europe is tightly scripted, and the script is written by men who believe heaven is always watching. But here's the twist. The church doesn't speak with one voice. Sure, St. Augustine thought that original sin was passed down through semen, which is deeply unsettling. But other thinkers, like Thomas Aquinas, were more nuanced, saying sexual pleasure isn't inherently evil, it just needs to be ordered properly, like, say, your wine cellar. Scholars today still debate how seriously these ideas were taken outside the pulpit. Were most people terrified of going to hell over a little premarital touching? Or were they too busy just trying to survive? Here's a quirky fact. Some believed that nighttime emissions, yep, wet dreams, were visits from demons, particularly seductive female ones called succubi. So break. If you woke up sticky, congratulations, you'd been ravished by a lusty she-demon. Naturally, priests had a whole protocol for dealing with this. It usually involved confession, fasting, and an awkward conversation with a red-faced monk. Still, the rules get blurrier when you look outside the church. Folk beliefs often ran parallel to doctrine. In the countryside, midwives and herbalists had their own takes on love and lust. Maybe the stars were involved, or maybe a love charm stitched into your sleeve. These practices weren't exactly endorsed by bishops, but they persisted. Sometimes they overlapped, like when priests used astrology to determine the best days for marital congress. Tuesdays, avoid them. Let's not forget the aristocrats. While peasants were being lectured on modesty, the nobility were composing steamy love poetry and commissioning art that makes modern emojis look shy. Courtly love, a whole genre of medieval romance, was basically a long poetic excuse to lust after someone you couldn't have, usually a married lady. And even though the text claimed it was all about spiritual longing, there was definitely some heavy breathing between the lines. So here you are, caught in a swirl of religious warnings, cultural contradictions, and your own inconvenient hormones. Everything you're told says to resist, to abstain, to walk the narrow path. But outside, you hear whispered stories of bathhouse rendezvous, of monks who sneak out at night, of secret trysts in barns and under festival tents. You're being told to feel shame, and yet, everywhere you look, someone is giving in. The contradiction isn't lost on you. In fact, it might be the single most defining feature of medieval sexuality, the endless tug-of-war between repression and reality. And if you think this is confusing now, just wait until we talk about the virginity inspections, the animal trials, and why doing it standing up might be a mortal sin. For now, though, sleep with one eye open. Your body is a battlefield, and the war's only just begun. The first time someone really examines your naked body, it's not romantic. It's medical, or, well, medieval medical, which is about as scientific as trying to cure a cough with a prayer and some hot goat butter. You're on a stool, probably naked from the waist down, and the room smells like old herbs, damp wool, and a hint of iron. The physician, who might also be your town's barber or a guy who just owns a lot of knives, is squinting at your urine in a glass bottle like it's a rare vintage. And in a sense it is, because back then, urine is one of the main diagnostic tools when it comes to fertility, pregnancy, and general body mystery. Welcome to the strange, often uncomfortable world of medieval sexual medicine. Spoiler: if you're a woman, you're more likely to be the one examined, blamed, or treated for anything involving sex and reproduction. Fertility especially is your burden. If you can't have children, it's probably your fault, not your husband's. Definitely not. Because sperm, after all, was considered a sort of holy essence, a divine spark. Meanwhile, your womb, that was a damp, moody cavern prone to wandering around your body when upset. Yes, hysteria comes from the idea that the uterus could just take a stroll up your spine and make you insane. So you sit there while the doctor asks about your menstrual cycle, your dreams, your appetite for salted meat, and whether you've been feeling unusually melancholic. He consults a chart, not a helpful chart, more like a zodiac wheel crossed with a fever dream. If you're lucky, you're given a drink made of mashed figs and rue. If not, they might try to align your womb by applying poultices, sometimes with garlic, sometimes with boiled ants, and then there's semen. Oh boy. The medieval understanding of semen: it was thought to be distilled from blood, heated in the male body until it achieved perfection. You know, like wine. That's why men were warned not to waste it on too much sex. Each drop was a dose of your very soul. This idea, oddly enough, wasn't just spiritual. It was medical. Sperm was precious. Women's bodies, on the other hand, were leaky, cold and unruly, supposedly in need of that warm essence to function properly. You, as a woman, might be told your sexual desire is higher than a man's, because nature in its chaos supposedly gave you that hunger to balance out your internal coldness. But don't act on it. Heaven forbid. Literally. Now, if you're trying to conceive and nothing's happening, here come the fertility tests. For women, one charming method involves inserting a garlic clove into the vagina overnight. If your breath smells garlicky in the morning, congrats. Your reproductive tunnel is open, and the issue is probably not you. For men, they might suggest drinking a concoction of wine and powdered dog testicles, or simply watching how your semen behaves in a bowl of water. If it floats, you're potent. If it sinks, well. There's also a widely believed theory that both partners must climax for conception to occur. That's right. In theory, medieval medicine promoted the idea that female orgasm wasn't just fun, it was necessary. Scholars still debate how seriously this was taken. Some argue it was just a way to rationalise reproduction, while others say it was rooted in genuine attempts to understand anatomy and balance. Still, imagine trying to explain to a monk that you're not pregnant because you didn't finish. That conversation probably ends with an exorcism, but let's not leave out the fringe stuff. There's always fringe stuff. Some medieval medical texts recommend using the bones of a black cat, ground into powder, as an aphrodisiac. Others say you should wear a badger's tooth around your neck to increase your libido. Want to be irresistible? Try sleeping with a slice of roasted owl under your pillow. Seriously, herbalism is the more respectable cousin of this chaos. Midwives and wise women have extensive knowledge of plants that affect menstruation, fertility, and even libido. Pennyroyal, rue, and mugwort are common, used both to help conceive and to prevent conception, depending on how and when they're administered. This is where things get dangerous, because herbal contraceptives blur the line between medicine and heresy. A woman who knows how to control her body is suspicious, powerful, and power, especially in the wrong hands, read female hands, is a threat to the social order. This brings us to the real fear humming underneath all this. Control. The church wants it. The doctors want it. Even your neighbours want it. Your sexuality, especially if you're a woman, is something to be managed, explained, treated, or punished. If your husband dies and you're childless, the rumours begin. If you're too forward with a smile or wear your belt too loose, the whispers follow you home. And God help you if you're a midwife who also happens to be good at growing herbs. That's 3 steps away from being labelled a witch. 2, if someone doesn't like you. By the time you're a teenager, you've learned that your body is full of signs and symbols for others to interpret. You're not just trying to survive famine or war. You're navigating a minefield of expectation, doctrine, and superstition, all tied to your genitals, and it's exhausting. Still, you find moments of rebellion. Maybe it's a lover's touch in the hayloft. Maybe it's a charm sewn secretly into your underdress. Maybe it's just laughing with the other girls while the town physician fumbles with his garlic tests. In these stolen moments, your body becomes yours again. Briefly. The deeper truth? Despite all the ignorance and pseudoscience medieval people were trying, they wanted answers, cures, understanding. They just didn't have microscopes or comprehensive sex ed. What they had were centuries-old texts, folk remedies, and a lot of trial and error. Mostly error. So, the next time you complain about WebMD or awkward doctor visits, imagine being diagnosed based on the taste of your spit or whether your belly button looks sullen. You'd kill for a pamphlet or a real gynecologist, but instead, you've got a monk with a chart, a bottle of urine, and way too much interest in your humours. You're 15 maybe, or 13, or 11. Doesn't really matter because no one asks how you feel about it. You're getting married. That's just how it is. Your parents have been talking to the neighbours for weeks. There was an exchange of goods, maybe a goat, maybe a patch of land. If you're lucky, you've met your future spouse once. If you're really lucky, they don't smell like spoiled onions and already have most of their teeth. This is the age of marital arrangements, not romantic sparks. Love is a side dish, not the main course. You exist, first and foremost, as a social and economic asset. For girls especially, your value is tied to your womb. A functioning reproductive system, a decent dowry, and a reputation that doesn't come with too much whispering. Those are your qualifications. Love letters, candlelit dinners. Try bartering over pigs and arguing about how many blankets will be gifted with the bride. Now, don't get ahead of yourself. Marriage doesn't always mean sex right away. Technically, canon law allows you to marry once you hit puberty, about 12 for girls and 14 for boys, but consummation can be delayed, especially if you're both still scrawny and covered in freckles. Sometimes you move in with your in-laws and wait a few years. Other times it's straight to the wedding bed, where things get ceremonial. The bedding ritual, that's a thing. You don't just sneak off after the wedding feast. No, you get escorted, paraded really, by family and friends into the bedchamber. There's laughter, teasing, even songs. Some customs include people throwing nuts or slippers. It's basically the most awkward group effort in history to ensure that, yes, the marriage is going to be sealed. Then everyone leaves you there, with your new spouse probably a little drunk, definitely terrified. And here's the worst part. You have no idea what to do. If you're a girl, no one's explained sex to you in terms more useful than, it will hurt, but it's holy. If you're a boy, you've probably pieced it together from farm animals, dirty jokes, and vague advice about not spilling your seed. No one talks about pleasure. No one tells you it's okay to be nervous. You're expected to just figure it out in the dark after a day of celebration and pressure. For women, the first time isn't just a personal experience, it's a public matter. Virginity is prized, fetishized, and heavily policed. In some communities, bloodstained sheets are displayed after the wedding night to prove the bride's purity. No blood. People talk. Rumours spread. If the marriage is politically important, you could be examined by a panel of grim-faced matrons. Or worse, accused of deception or adultery. Some women even fake the blood with animal parts or pricked fingers, because that's easier than trying to explain how hymens work. Spoiler, medieval folks didn't really understand them. Meanwhile, men aren't expected to be virgins, but they are expected to perform. If the groom can't get the job done, the marriage might be annulled. You'd think that'd be a private humiliation, but no. In some places, you're hauled in front of a church court and asked deeply invasive questions about your erections. Sometimes a group of men, actual witnesses, are assigned to observe you and report back. It's like a nightmare version of reality TV. And age? That's the part that really trips modern minds. Marrying in your early teens wasn't just accepted, it was encouraged in certain circles, especially among the nobility. The younger the bride, the longer her childbearing years, the better her chances of producing heirs. This wasn't just biology, it was dynasty planning. Think of it like Game of Thrones, but with less magic and way more real blood. Still, not everyone married that young. Among peasants, people often waited until their late teens or early 20s. They needed to save up, build a house, acquire some livestock, basic survival stuff. Even then, the church still tried to push its ideals. Marriage was a sacrament, a holy union, a reflection of divine order. But out in the fields, under the apple trees, behind the stables, people sometimes skipped the ceremony altogether. Hand fasting was common. A couple joined hands, said vows before witnesses, and boom, married. No priest required. This, of course, drove the church absolutely bananas. There's also the messier side, premarital sex. It happened. A lot. The records are full of it, usually from when things went wrong. Pregnancy, broken promises, public scandals. If a girl got pregnant before marriage, the man was expected to marry her, or at least pay support. If he refused, her family might haul him into court. Yes, actual church court, where sex lives were picked apart with chilling detail. Who initiated what, when, where, how many thrusts? Seriously, they wanted to know. And yet, for all this regulation, sex education was almost non-existent. You learned from whispered gossip, crude songs, maybe some scribbled drawings in the corner of a manuscript. If you were noble, you might read a guide written by a monk with zero hands-on experience. These texts warned you to avoid excessive lust, unnatural positions, or having sex during religious festivals. Monday? Fine. Friday? No way. Sunday? Sacrilegious. During Lent? Absolutely not, unless you wanted your baby to be born with a fishtail. Not even joking. Let's pause for a quick quirky detour. Some believe that the time and manner of sex could influence your baby's traits. Want a brave son? Do it during a thunderstorm. Want a beautiful daughter? Have sex facing east. Want twins? Better get acrobatic and chant a prayer to St. Anne. Scholars today mostly chalk this up to a desperate attempt to find meaning in randomness, but back then it was a way to feel in control, of fertility, of fate, of fear, because fear was everywhere. Death was close. Childbirth could kill you. A failed marriage could ruin your family. And desire. Desire was always lurking, always dangerous. So what do? You tiptoe. You obey the rituals. You laugh at the wedding feast, smile at your betrothed, try not to cry when the door closes. And maybe, just maybe, you find something tender in the dark. A hand that trembles like yours, a breath that calms your nerves. Something human, hidden beneath all the rules. The metal is cold, too cold, and it bites into your skin with every breath. You shift in your seat, but the thing doesn't budge. It's clamped tight. No, this isn't some medieval punishment device, at least not officially. This is a chastity belt. Or so the story goes. You've probably heard of them. Iron underwear, locked tight with a key held by your husband while he gallivants off to the Holy Land. The ultimate symbol of sexual control. But here's the truth you didn't get from cartoons or Renaissance fairs. Chastity belts, as most people imagine them, are probably a myth. Or at least, not that kind of myth. The kind that gets embroidered with each telling. until reality is so deeply buried beneath layers of Victorian fantasy that even historians have to squint. Let's start with what we do know. Yes, some actual metal belts exist in museums today, complete with ominous little locks and perforated plates. But here's the thing, most of them date from the 15th century or later, and even those are often dubious, likely made as conversation pieces or morality exhibits in the prudish 19th century. You know, the same century that decided table legs should wear modesty skirts and that women's ankles were an international scandal. So were chastity belts ever used? Probably not in the widespread strap your wife into iron panties kind of way. Not for real practical wear, because let's be honest, have you seen those things? They're absurdly impractical. Infection, bruising, bathroom logistics. It's not exactly daily wear friendly. More likely they were symbolic. Warnings, parodies. Even erotic novelties. Some were probably gag gifts for bored courtiers, an ironic twist on the fear of infidelity, not a serious anti-horny device. And yet the idea took off. Why? Because the concept of a chastity belt fits perfectly with medieval anxieties around sex and control, especially women's sexuality. Imagine the appeal for a jealous husband, a paranoid churchman, or a writer trying to make a moral point. A literal lockbox for lust. How tidy, how terrifying. It wasn't just men who feared female desire. Women too were taught to see their bodies as sources of sin and temptation. If you're a young girl in a noble household, you're expected to be modest, silent, pure. Your virtue is a family asset, your virginity a negotiating chip. You might be watched closely, your letters read, your steps shadowed, all to protect your honour. But what they're really guarding is your value, to a husband, to a dowry deal, to your father's ambitions. This obsession with chastity didn't stop at belts. There were herbal tonics said to cool the humours, making girls less lustful. Spiked corsets, scolds' bridles, virtue badges sewn into dresses, each one a tiny shrine to the idea that desire must be locked away, disguised, erased. But here's where things get really twisted. While women were being warned to stay chaste, the same society was riddled with jokes, songs, and stories about sneaking around that very chastity. There's a whole genre of medieval literature, fablio, that deals in sex, trickery, and the delightful chaos of lovers outwitting controlling husbands. Think Chaucer, but hornier. These tales often end with someone naked in a barrel, or a friar hiding under a bed. They're bawdy, irreverent, and proof that the public message didn't always match private behaviour. So you've got two parallel realities running side by side. In one, chastity is sacred. In the other, it's a joke everyone's in on. And let's talk about the Virgin Mary, because oh boy did she set the bar way too high. She wasn't just chaste, she conceived without even having sex. That's the gold standard. Meanwhile, actual medieval women are expected to give birth, a lot, but still somehow embody virgin-like modesty. It's the ultimate contradiction. Be fertile but not sexual. Be desirable but not desiring. Be available but only on someone else's terms. Now, historians still debate how much of this was just rhetoric and how much was real pressure. Were women actually being locked up or violently punished for a flirtatious glance? Sometimes, but more often it was a quiet, daily grind. A life of internalized fear, rules, and double standards. You learn to sit with your knees together. You drop your gaze. You whisper your confessions with trembling lips, even if your only sin was daydreaming about the blacksmith's apprentice. Here's a fringe fact to chew on. In some religious communities, young girls were literally married to Christ, veiled like brides, placed under the protection of the church. Some were barely teenagers, and this spiritual marriage meant they were off limits forever, tucked into convents where they could be safely holy and untouched. Problem is, those convents weren't always as chaste as advertised. But we'll get to that in another chapter. Meanwhile, back among the laity, marriage is supposedly the honourable outlet for sex. But even inside the marriage bed, the rules follow you. There are sanctioned positions, 1, sanctioned purposes, procreation only, and sanctioned days. Certain saints really don't want you doing it on their feast. If you get too creative, or God forbid actually enjoy yourself, you might have some explaining to do at your next confession. And yet, people still did it. Frequently, joyfully, secretly. The church was powerful, yes, but it wasn't omnipresent. It couldn't stop a smirk behind a veil or a quick rendezvous in the mill house. The fact that the rules were so strict only made the breaking of them more delicious. Forbidden fruit has always been the tastiest. So here you are, in a society that claims to value chastity above all, while being obsessed with sex from every possible angle. You're told to guard your virtue with your life, but also that your worth lies in being desired. It's a maddening paradox. And no amount of iron underwear can truly resolve it. You lie awake at night, listening to the quiet creaks of the house, wondering if your thoughts are sinful, if your desires will condemn you. If anyone else feels this confused, they do, but no one says it out loud. The belts may be fake, but the fear, very, very real. The air in the cloister smells faintly of wax, old stone, and something herbal, lavender maybe, or whatever they've been growing behind the kitchen. You shuffle through the corridors in soft sandals, your robes whispering around your ankles. You're supposed to be thinking about God, contemplation, discipline, chastity. But let's be honest, you're mostly thinking about Brother Matthias. Monks, like everyone else in medieval Europe, have bodies, and those bodies don't stop being bodies just because you shaved your head and took a vow. In fact, monastic life, with all its silence and structure, seems to magnify desire rather than eliminate it. You're told to rise before dawn, to fast, to pray 7 times a day, to purge impure thoughts with labour and cold baths, and for a while, you try. You really try. But then Brother Matthias brushes past you in the scriptorium, his sleeve grazing yours, and something stirs. Not just lust, it's something lonelier and deeper than that. Something about connection. And suddenly, your path to holiness starts to feel like a tightrope walk over a chasm filled with very earthly temptations. Monks are meant to be celibate, but let's not kid ourselves, many aren't. This isn't some modern scandal. Medieval people knew it. There are enough records to make it clear. Clerical celibacy was more of an ideal than a consistent reality. By the 12th century, the Church made a real push to enforce it, but enforcement was, shall we say, inconsistent. Some clergy had unofficial wives or housekeepers. Others had dalliances behind abbey walls. There were even jokes about priests with too many children to support. And monks had options. In theory, monastic life is a retreat from the chaos of the world. In practice, it's a pressure cooker. Dozens, sometimes hundreds of men living together, isolated from society, tightly scheduled and expected to suppress every human urge. And when you suppress something long enough, it doesn't disappear. It mutates. It finds cracks to leak through. So you confess a lot. The confessional becomes both a safety valve and a trap. You kneel, whisper your failings, promise to do better. But the next week you're back. The Church encouraged regular confession, which led to some strange dynamics, especially around sex. In some abbeys, confessors would ask deeply personal questions, digging for specifics about fantasies, self-pleasure, even nocturnal emissions. It was part spiritual guidance, part surveillance, and sometimes something else. Here's a historical fact to chew on. There were documented scandals involving monks confessing to each other in ways that veered into emotional or even physical entanglements. The lines between sin and intimacy blurred. In some orders, intense spiritual friendships developed, bonds so passionate they were seen as suspect. Was it love? Was it lust? Even the monks couldn't always tell, but let's not make the mistake of thinking monasteries were dens of scandal. Many monks lived sincerely disciplined lives, genuinely seeking spiritual purity. They copied texts, cared for the sick, taught, prayed. Still, they were human. And in the margins of their illuminated manuscripts, you sometimes find odd little drawings, naked figures, animals doing human things, even monks with erections. They're not always sexual. Sometimes they're just weird. But the fact that they're there tells you something. The inner world of the monastery wasn't always as holy as the facade. Now, about Brother Matthias. Maybe he comes to your cell after Compline, claiming he wants to discuss the Psalms. Maybe he lingers too long. Maybe he touches your hand and the contact burns through your resolve. What happens next? Well, that depends on you, and your fear of being caught. Because yes, the Church had rules, so many rules, and punishments. A monk caught in a sexual relationship, especially one with another man, could face penance, expulsion, or worse, but enforcement was, again, wildly uneven. Some superiors looked the other way, others were involved themselves. There are letters, complaints, even papal condemnations documenting centuries of clerical sexual misconduct, not just between consenting adults, but in darker, more exploitative contexts. Still, same-sex desire wasn't always seen through a modern lens. The language used was different. Often, these connections were framed in terms of spiritual failure or improper affection rather than sexual identity. Historians debate whether these relationships were seen as homosexual in the way we understand it today, or as something else entirely. An expression of misdirected love, perhaps. The truth is, medieval people didn't categorize desire in the same tidy boxes we do now. Here's a quirky fringe fact. Some medieval monastic texts warn about the dangers of too much eye contact. Yes, really. Long gazes could lead to temptation. So could sitting too close, or singing too sweetly, or offering someone a particularly fluffy cushion. In a world that tries to regulate every movement of the body, even kindness becomes suspect. And yet, despite all this, there's something strangely beautiful about the quiet connections that bloomed in these rigid environments. Moments of shared humanity, of understanding. Not all desire ended in sin. Some of it ended in poetry, like the love letters exchanged between monks that survive to this day, written in Latin, full of longing and tenderness. Whether they acted on those feelings or not, the emotions were real. You begin to understand that the monastery isn't a place where desire disappears. It's where it's refined, reframed, hidden, and occasionally it erupts, messy, inconvenient, and entirely human. Eventually, maybe you're caught, or maybe you leave, or maybe you spend the rest of your days burying the memory beneath layers of prayer. Either way, you carry it with you, proof that even in the most sacred spaces the body still speaks, and sometimes it whispers someone else's name in the dark. You're sitting in the back of a candlelit chapel, your head bowed, trying to pay attention to the Latin droning from the pulpit. The incense is thick tonight, clinging to your skin and seeping into your clothes. It's warm and you're tired, but your eyes keep drifting, not to the stained glass, not to the crucifix, but to the edges of the pages in the prayer book in front of you. And what do you find there, tucked beside the psalms and sermons? A doodle. Except this isn't your typical flower or decorative swirl, it's definitely a penis, possibly walking on legs, possibly dueling another penis. Welcome to the strange and absolutely unhinged world of medieval Marginalia. You're probably wondering what kind of monk spends hours copying sacred texts only to add erotic scribbles to the borders. The answer, a bored one, a cheeky one, a human one. And while the main text may be scripture, law, or medicine, the margins are something else entirely. A chaotic playground for satire, fantasy, and forbidden thoughts. These aren't official statements, they're whispers, rebellions, inside jokes scribbled in the corners of holy books. Marginalia, those tiny illustrations and notes scrawled along the edges of manuscripts, tell you more about the real mindset of the medieval scribe than any theological treatise ever could. Sure, the church is trying to uphold moral standards, but meanwhile Brother Aidan is drawing two monks mooning each other in the margins of a book about divine punishment. The contradiction is almost too perfect. Some of the art is absurd. Knights jousting with snails, monkeys dressed as bishops, naked people riding geese. But a surprising number of these little illustrations involve overtly sexual imagery. Men with grotesquely exaggerated genitals, women doing things with trees that should not be done with trees, and yes, even animals caught in very compromising positions. And it's not like this was one rogue monastery doing their own thing. This stuff shows up across Europe, from England to France to Italy. Different styles, different texts, same bizarre energy. What gives? Were these monks secretly perverts? Not necessarily. Think of it as a release valve. When your entire life revolves around copying holy text under strict silence for hours each day, your brain will wander. The margins become a space where that wandering turns visual. It wasn't always monks either. By the late Middle Ages, secular scribes and artists were increasingly involved in book production. Some were hired by nobles, others worked in urban scriptoria where the atmosphere was less cloistered and more guild-like. And in these spaces, humour, especially the risque kind, flourished. Erotic marginalia wasn't a threat to orthodoxy. It was more like a low-key rebellion, an acknowledgement that the world isn't as tidy and pious as the main text would have you believe. Of course, not everyone was amused. Some church leaders railed against immoral art in sacred books. But cracking down was difficult when the offending material was literally hidden in the margins, and often so strange that you couldn't quite decide if it was sinful or just confusing. Here's a quirky historical fact. One manuscript contains a drawing of a nun harvesting penises from a tree. Yep, just plucking them like ripe pears. No one knows exactly what it's supposed to mean. Fertility? Power? A joke? Maybe it was just someone's weird fantasy rendered in ink while their supervisor wasn't watching. Scholars still debate the interpretation, which is a fancy way of saying they're also baffled but trying to sound academic about it. But the weirdest thing, these images were sometimes right next to deeply religious text. You'd have a full-page illumination of the crucifixion, and just 2 inches below it, a rabbit with a sword fighting a naked man. The juxtaposition is jarring and fascinating. It suggests that medieval people didn't have the same compulsive need to separate the sacred and the profane. Maybe they understood, better than we do, that life is both, that faith and desire, awe and absurdity, holiness and horniness all coexist, sometimes quite literally side by side. And let's not pretend literacy was widespread. Most people couldn't read these manuscripts, but images, those they could understand. A racy sketch or a visual joke could be shared, pointed at, laughed over in the scriptorium. The audience wasn't just the elite patron who bought the book, it was also the scribes, illuminators, and binders who handled it every day. So here you are, a scribe in your 20s, tasked with copying the rule of St. Benedict. By page 12, your hand is cramping and your mind is wandering. You think about the girl from the bakery, or that wandering friar with the deep voice, or something less noble entirely, and before you know it, your quill has danced a little too freely. Maybe it's just a face sticking out of a flower. Maybe it's a naked backside in the O of omnes. It's subtle, playful, but it's yours. And centuries later, someone finds your doodle and stares at it, laughing or squinting or trying to decode its meaning. And in that moment, you're connected, across time, space, language, not through doctrine, not through dogma, but through shared weirdness. Of course, not all marginalia is sexual. Some of it is just delightfully strange, but the sexual bits, they're a reminder that even in an age obsessed with purity and restraint, people were still people, with fantasies, with boredom, with a wicked sense of humour. This kind of imagery wasn't confined to books either. You'll find similarly cheeky carvings in cathedrals, under pews and on misericords, the little wooden seats monks leaned against during long services. Imagine kneeling in prayer and glancing down to see a carved figure mooning you from beneath the bench. That's not an accident. That's a centuries-old tradition of lowbrow comedy hiding in plain sight, and scholars still argue about it. Was it all just humour? Was it meant to warn, to mock, to educate? We may never know. But the fact that these images exist, hidden in holy books and carved into sacred spaces, tells you everything about the contradictions of the era. So next time you imagine the Middle Ages as a time of cold chastity and tight moral controls, think again. Somewhere, in a quiet scriptorium lit by flickering candlelight, a monk is biting back a grin as he inks a chicken with human legs into the corner of the psalter. Because yes, even holiness needs a little mischief now and then. The heat hits you first, not just the warmth from the fires, but a thick, wet heaviness in the air, steam rising from a copper cauldron, mingling with the scent of herbs, wet skin and candle smoke. You step into the bathhouse and feel your clothes already starting to cling. Around you, people lounge in the haze, laughing, splashing, rinsing and soaking. This is not some grimy medieval cesspit. This is a place of leisure, community, and yes, sometimes a place of sex. Bathhouses in medieval Europe were surprisingly common, especially in cities. The Romans may have perfected the public bath, but their medieval descendants didn't let the idea go to waste. From Paris to Prague, bathhouses served as both hygiene hubs and social salons. You've probably heard that medieval people didn't bathe. That's a myth. They bathed plenty, sometimes daily, depending on class and location. They just didn't have plumbing and TikTok-ready skincare routines. What they did have were bath attendants, communal tubs, and lots of strategically placed towels. You ease into the warm water, sighing as the heat loosens your muscles. The person across from you, naked, smiling, unbothered, asks where you're from. Maybe it's flirtation, maybe it's just conversation. Because here's the thing about medieval bathhouses. They were spaces of disarming intimacy. Everyone's exposed. Nakedness isn't taboo, it's just part of the scene. Of course, not every bathhouse was the same. Some were co-ed, others had separate hours for men and women, some were attached to inns and taverns, others operated as high-end establishments, offering food, wine and musicians to entertain you while you soaked. You might rent a private tub with your spouse, or sneak in with someone else's. And here's where things get slippery, literally and figuratively. While many bathhouses were strictly for cleaning and relaxation, others became known for more carnal services. A soak followed by a massage, followed by, well, you know. The lines between a public bath and a brothel weren't always clearly drawn. In some places they overlapped entirely. Take South Germany in the 15th century. Bathhouses, or Badstuben, were sometimes run by married couples, with the wife serving as bath attendant and the husband handling food and maintenance. Totally respectable. But in bigger cities you start seeing phrases like serviced baths, or heated companionship popping up in the records. Men would enter with a towel and leave with their hair tousled and a guilty look. Town officials often turned a blind eye, especially if the establishment paid its taxes and didn't cause too much noise. The church, of course, was deeply suspicious. A public place where men and women bathed together, where the body wasn't just visible but celebrated. Scandalous, dangerous, lust-provoking. Sermons warned that the bathhouse was a gateway to damnation, where hot water turned cool virtue into boiling sin. But that didn't stop anyone. Because let's face it, when you spend your days knee-deep in livestock and social expectations, an evening in a hot bath with wine and company is worth the risk of eternal fire. There's a lingering lavender scent in the steam now, and someone pours warm water over your shoulders. You're suddenly aware of your own skin, of their fingers brushing yours, of the low hum of voices punctuated by laughter. There's a closeness here, one that's physical and sensory, but not always sexual. Sometimes the bathhouse is just a place where touch is safe, where you're not being judged, measured, or sermonized. You're just human, warm and floating. And yet your eyes catch two figures slipping behind a curtain at the far end of the room. They don't come back out. You exchange glances with the attendant. She just shrugs and brings you more wine. Here's a fun fringe fact. In some cities, bathhouses had their own slang, a kind of code used by staff and regulars to describe services discreetly. A long rinse might mean a full-body massage. A double bucket might mean more than one visitor in the same tub. Historians have unearthed some of these terms, though their meanings are often debated. Still, the point is clear. Medieval people weren't clueless about pleasure. They were just discreet. Mostly. But discretion only gets you so far. By the late Middle Ages, as plagues and religious reform movements spread, bathhouses started to fall out of favour. Cities closed them down over fears of disease. Preachers denounced them as dens of vice. And with the rise of Protestantism came a new wave of sexual anxiety. Public bathing, once normal, began to seem indecent, unsanitary, immoral, and yet in the earlier centuries bathhouses were woven into daily life. Not just as places to get clean, but as social crossroads. You might bump into a merchant, a noble, a midwife, a monk. Gossip flowed as freely as the water. Deals were struck, alliances formed, and yes, a few love affairs began with a slippery handshake beneath the surface. Were bathhouses brothels in disguise? Not always. Some were strictly regulated, with fines for inappropriate behaviour. Others leaned into the wink-wink reputation and provided private chambers behind the main tubs. The line was always moving, shaped by local customs, economy, and who's currently holding the moral torch. There's still one more scholarly debate here. Were these spaces liberating or exploitative? For women working in bathhouses, some of whom were also sex workers, it could be both. A place to earn a living, to wield a kind of soft power, but also a place where men with money and status held all the cards. It depended on the city, the staff, the clientele. There are records of madams who ran bathhouses like little empires, commanding respect and paying taxes like any other business. There are also records of women prosecuted, abused, or forced into work they didn't choose. Tonight, though, you're just a visitor. Another figure in the mist, letting the water lull you into forgetting the harsh world outside for a while. Your skin prunes, your limbs relax. Someone offers you a plum. You don't ask where it came from. Eventually you step out, towel off, and redress in the cool evening air. Your clothes feel stiff after the warmth of the bath. The outside world rushes back in, noise, dirt, the chill of night. But for a little while you floated. You touched and were touched. You felt what it meant to be soft and bare and real. And in medieval Europe, that's as close as some people ever got to freedom. The court is quiet, except for the distant sound of a lute being tuned. You sit at the edge of a long wooden bench, dressed in layers too thick for comfort, trying not to fidget as the lady 2 seats away tilts her head and sighs. You steal a glance. She's watching someone, him. The young knight with curls too perfect to be accidental, reciting poetry with the kind of practiced anguish that suggests he's read it into a mirror. Twice. And you realise something. This is going to be one of those nights. A night of yearning, of love, unconsummated. Welcome to the maddening world of courtly love, a medieval invention so emotionally charged it could power a whole village with unfulfilled desire. Now, let's get this out of the way. Courtly love is not about sex. In fact, its lack of sex is kind of the point. It's all about longing. Beautiful, frustrating, poetic longing. It's a game with rules, designed to keep you just close enough to burn but never close enough to touch. The object of your affection is always above you, socially, morally, or both. Usually married, often untouchable. The thrill comes not from getting them, but from wanting them so well that your suffering becomes a kind of art. The poets of the time were obsessed. Troubadours, trouvères, and minne singers wandered the courts of France, Germany, and beyond, singing songs of idealized women and hopeless yearning. A perfect lady smiles at you. That's a week's worth of verses. She drops her glove. You'll wear it into battle. She lets you look at her while she eats fruit. You'll cry about it under a tree for 3 days. Love, in this system, is spiritual warfare. You fall on your metaphorical sword repeatedly, and if you're lucky, she might give you a secret smile in return. But let's not mistake this for innocent puppy love. These poems, when you really read them, are deeply erotic. Not explicit, but charged. Every glance is loaded, every hand grays a crisis. It's all simmering under the surface. A knight might describe his lady's ankle with such intensity, you'd think it had its own gravitational pull. Yet the point is always the same. Desire denied is more powerful than desire fulfilled. Here's a historical fact. Andreas Capellanus, a 12th century chaplain at the court of Marie de Champagne, wrote an actual manual on love, titled De Amor, On Love. It's a bizarre, often satirical text that outlines the supposed rules of courtly love. These include gems like, marriage is no excuse for not loving, and a true lover always trembles. It's part parody, part guidebook, and entirely bonkers. But it tells us a lot about how people talked about love, even if they didn't always live by these rules. Now, what's the point of all this suffering? Why invent a system that seems custom-built to torture everyone involved? Well, partly because it was safe, especially for noble women. In a world where your body, marriage, and future were all controlled by others, courtly love let you hold emotional power. You could receive poems, glances, favours. You could reject advances with a smile or a verse. You were the queen of an imaginary kingdom where hearts, not lands, were conquered. It was a rare form of agency, but that's just the surface. Dig deeper, and you find the social glue. Courtly love served a function. It taught etiquette. It structured interactions between men and women. It helped noble courts, which could be wildly chaotic, maintain a kind of elegant tension. Affairs may have happened behind closed doors, sure, but in public. Everyone played the game. Everyone longed, sighed, recited, and if you didn't, you were boring. There's a moment at the feast later that night. The lady passes you a token, a ribbon, a ring, a folded note. Your heart races. It's nothing and everything. You can't speak about it. You can't act on it. But it lives under your tunic, against your skin. That's enough to fuel you through 100 dull winters. Here's the quirky fringe detail. Some medieval courts staged actual mock trials of love. People would present cases. My lady has ignored my song for 3 days and I suffer grievously, and the court, often presided over by noblewomen, would deliver a verdict. These love tribunals were both satire and serious play, blending performance with emotional politics. Imagine Judge Judy, but instead of arguing about a broken lease, you're litigating heartbreak with rhyming metaphors. Of course, not everyone believed in the purity of it all. Satirists rolled their eyes. Clergy condemned it. To some, it was just emotional adultery dressed up in fancy language. Others thought it was dangerous, a gateway drug to actual affairs, political instability, or worse, poetry. And they weren't always wrong. Which brings us to the real debate. Did people really live this way? Or was it just a literary fantasy? Scholars still argue about it. Some say courtly love was mostly fiction, a poetic ideal that never really played out in real life. Others point to letters, gifts, and the occasional very inconvenient love child as proof that people definitely took it seriously. The truth probably lies somewhere in the middle. People performed courtly love, even if they didn't always believe it. Like Instagram, but with more embroidery. So here you are, stuck in a system where love is everywhere, but always just out of reach. Where touching the hem of a dress means more than actual intimacy. Where emotions are high-stakes currency, and silence often says more than words. It's both beautiful and exhausting, and it doesn't end when the music stops. You walk back to your chamber, her ribbon tucked beneath your shirt, already composing your next stanza in your head. Maybe tomorrow she'll smile again, maybe she'll nod when you pass, maybe she'll write something back, or maybe she won't, and you'll suffer, beautifully. Because in courtly love, the suffering is the point. You wake up to the sound of boots in the hall and a knock that isn't really asking permission. The door swings open, and there he is, the Lord. Or maybe it's the reeve, the steward, someone sent on his behalf. Either way, they've come for your wife, or your daughter, or maybe just your silence. Because the man who owns the land under your feet also believes he has certain rights. And whether those rights are real or just assumed, tonight, he's acting on them. Welcome to one of the most unsettling rumours of medieval sexuality. Droit du Seigneur, or the Lord's right. You've probably heard the phrase tossed around. This idea that noblemen had the legal right to sleep with a peasant's bride on her wedding night. The very thought of it makes your skin crawl. A grotesque mix of power, sex, and feudal entitlement. But was it real? Let's take a breath, because the answer is messy, and the myth is louder than the facts. Historically, there's no concrete law in medieval Europe that codified such a practice. No parchment, no official edict stating, "Thou shalt hand over thy bride to Sir Creeps-a-lot." Yet the rumour persists, fueled by literature, legend, and the painful truth that in a deeply hierarchical world, powerful men didn't need laws to do terrible things, they just needed impunity. So while there may not have been a legal right, there was very much a reality, a culture in which noblemen wielded sexual access as one more weapon in their arsenal of control. It wasn't about romance. It wasn't even about lust half the time. It was about ownership. A man who could tax your harvest, command your labour, and hang you for stealing bread might also help himself to your wife. And what were you going to do? File a complaint. Marriage was sacred, yes, but so was property. And to a lord, you were both. If he wanted to insert himself into your private life, literally and figuratively, there wasn't much recourse. Some lords offered protection in exchange for the favour. Others framed it as a right, a tradition, something your father endured and your son will too. You keep your head down, you keep your mouth shut. The fields need ploughing either way. Now, for the scholars in the back row, the idea of droit du seigneur appears in a lot of medieval and early modern literature, especially in satire and plays. Voltaire mentions it. So does Shakespeare, sort of. But as far as legal historians can tell, it was more myth than mandate. Still, myths are powerful, and they don't appear out of nowhere. They grow from soil fertilized by fear and experience. In this case, the myth reveals the deeply unequal sexual politics of the time. Let's say you're the bride, it's your wedding night and you've been warned. Your mother cried when she braided your hair. Your husband clenched his fists. The knock comes, and there's no choice. The Lord might not use force exactly. He might offer gifts or coin, or simply rely on your inability to say no. Later, you're expected to return to your new husband and pretend nothing happened. That's the deal, that's feudalism. In some regions, there were weird customs that echo this power dynamic. For example, a lord might demand a symbolic payment before a marriage could be recognised. Sometimes a coin, sometimes a chicken, sometimes even the bride's first night spent in his house. It didn't always involve sex, but the suggestion was there. Like a worm in the apple. Was it symbolic? Was it ritualised coercion? Depends who you ask. Here's a quirky historical tangent. In a few parts of Europe, there were genuinely weird bedding customs where the entire village participated. Think, the couple's wedding bed carried through the streets, laughter, teasing, songs about fertility and virility. In some cases, the newlyweds would be watched to ensure consummation. Yes, watched, or at least heard. Because what's more romantic than performing under pressure with the entire village listening at the door? And let's not forget the role of clergy in all this. Technically, the church condemned any interference in a marriage. Sex was only licit between spouses and consent mattered. But when the offender was a generous patron or a powerful lord, the enforcement of morality got flexible. Confession and penance were always options after all. A few prayers, maybe a donation, and you were good as new. Still, the tension between ideals and reality was stark. The church preached the sanctity of marriage, while feudal lords treated peasants like livestock. Sex was supposed to be holy, but in practice it was often transactional. Marriage for peasants was about survival, alliances, and making more labourers. Love, if it happened, was a bonus. Consent? That was a luxury reserved for the powerful. Some women pushed back, quietly. A refusal here, a relocation there. Others survived by pretending nothing had happened. A few used what little leverage they had. Rumours, shame, the threat of scandal. But the structure was built to protect the lord, not the peasant. So most stories ended the same way, in silence. And yet the myth of droit du seigneur survives, because it feels true. It captures the horror of a system that gave one man absolute power over everyone beneath him, including their bodies. Whether it was law or legend hardly matters to the girl in the bed, waiting for footsteps outside her door. You're lying there now, staring at the low beams above your head, heart pounding. Your husband hasn't said a word since the feast. Neither of you slept, and the moment stretches on like a held breath. Then, nothing. No knock. Maybe tonight, the rumour stays a rumour, maybe the Lord has other plans, or maybe he's just too drunk to remember. Still, you don't exhale until the sun rises. The room is dimly lit by a single flickering candle, its flame casting long shadows on the rough stone walls. You're lying on a bed covered with coarse linens, your heart pounding. Not from passion, but from fear. Tonight is the infamous first night, and with it comes a tradition as invasive as it is brutal. The virginity test. You probably thought this was a myth, or a twisted invention of some gothic novel. But no, this was very real, very serious, and very, very uncomfortable. So what exactly happens? The night after the wedding, a midwife, or sometimes a group of older women from the village, is summoned to your bedroom. Their task? To examine you and provide proof of your purity. The evidence most sought after is blood, supposedly shed when the hymen breaks. Sheets might be spread beneath the bed to catch this prize symbol. Blood on the linens means you are a virgin, a good wife in the eyes of your new family and the community. No blood? Oh dear, that's trouble. It's a strange, often terrifying ritual wrapped in layers of superstition, control, and social pressure. The examination itself could be humiliating. Women, sometimes strangers, poking and prodding parts of your body meant to be private. And all for what? To confirm that your value, your honour, your entire future was intact. Virginity was not just a personal matter, it was a public asset, a currency in a deeply patriarchal economy. The stakes were high. If you failed the test, you might face accusations of promiscuity, deceit, or worse. Your husband might reject you, your dowry could be reduced, the whole village might whisper behind your back, and in extreme cases your family could be shamed, or you could be accused of witchcraft or fraud. But here's the kicker. Many medieval women didn't bleed the first night. Medical science today tells us that the hymen is a flimsy membrane that not all women have, or it can be stretched or torn from activities unrelated to sex. horseback riding, heavy lifting, even just growing up. Yet medieval people didn't know this. Their understanding was shaped by myths, limited anatomy, and cultural obsession. This led to frequent false failures. Some clever women anticipated this and prepared. Animal blood was sometimes used to fake the proof. A goat's or sheep's blood was discreetly smeared on sheets. Others carefully pierced the skin of their finger to produce a drop of blood. It was a grim game, a performance to meet impossible expectations. Even more disturbing were the rumours that some midwives would take bribes to overlook or manipulate results. The whole process was fraught with corruption and fear. In a society where women had little power, these tests became another tool of surveillance and control over their bodies and sexuality. And this was just the beginning. The obsession with virginity extended beyond the wedding night. Some communities enforced strict curfews for unmarried women. Others imposed chastity belts, or at least threatened them, though actual use was rare, as we discussed earlier. Songs and stories reinforced the ideal, the pure, untouchable bride who guarded her virtue as fiercely as a knight guarded his honour. Here's a fringe fact to lighten the mood. Some medieval medical texts claimed that a virgin's first sexual encounter should happen on specific days of the week or under certain astrological signs to ensure fertility and good health. Friday? No good. Tuesday? Better. Mercury in retrograde? Forget it. If you wanted a strong, healthy baby, you had to play by the stars and hope your husband was a good enough actor to follow along. The church, meanwhile, had a complicated stance. Virginity was highly prized, especially for nuns and saints, but they also recognised that most people married and had sex. Confessionals were filled with admissions of impurity, and priests often offered guidance on how to properly approach marital sex to avoid sin. Still, the idea of purity as a spiritual and social ideal was deeply ingrained. This ritual reflects a larger debate historians wrestle with. How much of medieval sexuality was truly about personal pleasure and love? And how much was about power, reputation, and control? The virginity test, for all its horror, was less about the bride's body and more about the family's honour, the husband's property rights, and community standards. Imagine the pressure on a young woman, already navigating marriage, childbirth, and household duties, now burdened with the impossible task of proving her worth through a bloodstained sheet. It's a moment where private and public collide, where your body becomes a symbol in a game you didn't choose to play. You close your eyes, imagining the weight of the night, the whispers, the fear, the cold hands checking for something that can't always be found. You wonder if any of this ever felt like love. You kneel in the dim light of the chapel, the scent of burning wax and incense thick in the air, your hands trembling as you clutch the rosary beads. It's confession time, the moment when your darkest secrets are whispered into the ear of a man wearing a collar, expecting absolution. But in medieval Europe, confession wasn't just a spiritual cleansing, it was a full-on inventory of your sexual misdeeds, and the checklist was extensive. You begin with the obvious sins: lustful thoughts, masturbation, impure fantasies. The priest probes gently, then more insistently. Did you look upon a neighbour with desire? Did you entertain thoughts of another woman's husband? Did you touch yourself inappropriately? The questions grow more explicit. Have you kissed, embraced, or committed fornication? What about anal or oral acts? Yes, those were on the list. Did you deny your spouse? Use contraception? Each yes adds weight to your penance and your guilt. The Church's obsession with sex was paradoxical. On one hand, it condemned all sexual acts outside marriage, and even within marriage it demanded restraint and moderation. On the other hand, it recognized sex as a necessary evil for procreation. Pleasure was suspicious, often labelled as the devil's playground. You find yourself caught in a web of desire and discipline, sin and salvation. Here's a historical fact. The Summa Confessorum, a popular manual for priests, included detailed guidelines on how to interrogate penitents about sexual sins. Priests were encouraged to ask very specific questions, sometimes encouraging confession by listing potential sins aloud. The goal was to ensure no sin remained hidden, no sin too shameful to confess. This level of scrutiny led to some bizarre dynamics. Confessors sometimes became sex therapists, or at least the closest thing available. Penitents sought advice on how to avoid sin while maintaining marital relations. Was it okay to enjoy sex if you were married? How often could you perform without offending God? Which positions were acceptable? Did your thoughts during sex matter? Spoiler, yes, very much. The confessional was a paradoxical space, both a place of judgment and of relief. You might spill your secrets and receive forgiveness, or you might be burdened with humiliating penances. These could include fasting, pilgrimages, wearing special badges, or public humiliation. The more serious the sin, the heavier the penalty. A quirky fringe fact: some confessors kept sin charts to track common offences. Lust was always high on the list, but so were more obscure ones, like sinning with animals, or making love during forbidden hours. Some confessions were so detailed and bizarre that modern scholars struggled to determine if they reflect real behaviour or the fears and fantasies of the time. There's also a fascinating debate among historians about the role confession played in medieval sexual culture. Did it help regulate behaviour and reduce sin, or did it create an unhealthy obsession with sex, turning natural desires into sources of anxiety and shame? Some argue confession was a tool of control, while others see it as a complex negotiation between personal desire and religious duty. Imagine the relief of confessing a sinful thought only to be told you're forgiven, but the crushing shame of admitting to an act considered worse, like adultery or sodomy. The stakes were high, and the confessional was often a battleground of conscience. You realise the confessional wasn't just about morality, it was about power. The Church wielded the ability to define sin, grant forgiveness, and demand obedience. It shaped not only what people did, but how they thought about their own bodies and desires. So you leave the chapel, heart lighter but mind tangled, aware that every glance, every touch, every fantasy carries weight far beyond the physical. You carry your sins like invisible chains, hoping for mercy, fearing judgment. And in this delicate balance of confession and concealment, medieval Europeans lived their most private truths, often in silence, often in fear, but always under the watchful eyes of faith. The barnyard is alive with morning sounds, clucking hens, lowing cows, and the occasional braying donkey. You're stepping carefully over a stray chicken when you overhear hushed voices. The topic? Something shocking. Bestiality. Or, as the medieval legal codes preferred to call it, sins against nature. It's a crime that echoes through the courts, the confessions, and the gossip mill alike, sending shivers down your spine. Because yes, in medieval Europe, laws against sex with animals weren't just taboo, they were terrifyingly real. You probably think bestiality is a fringe issue, a rarity whispered about in dark corners. But surprise, it was a surprisingly common accusation, often more about social control and religious panic than actual widespread behaviour. The church and secular authorities viewed it as a grave sin, a sign that society was unravelling at its most basic level. If people were breaking the boundaries between species, what did that say about order, morality, and God's plan? Courts handed down severe punishments, sometimes death, sometimes public humiliation. Trial records from places like France and Germany reveal bizarre cases: a man accused of attempting intercourse with a donkey, a woman charged with fondling a pig, or even rumours of entire villages under suspicion. The legal language is explicit, the moral outrage loud. But here's the twist. Some scholars argue that accusations of bestiality were often more about scapegoating. If crops failed, or disease spread, or harvests were poor, blaming deviant sexual behaviour was an easy explanation. It was a way to channel fear and anxiety, to point fingers at outsiders or misfits. The accused might be marginalised individuals, widows, servants, or those already suspected of witchcraft. In other words, bestiality charges could be weaponised. The Church's fear of sins against nature wasn't just about the act itself, but about the symbolic breach it represented. The medieval worldview was built on strict hierarchies between God and man and animal, male and female. Crossing these lines threatened the cosmic order. Bestiality was a nightmare vision of chaos, a disruption of nature's harmony that demanded harsh correction. Interestingly, some texts reveal a surprising variety in attitudes. While all condemned the act as sinful, some medical and theological writers debated the nature of consent and intent. Could animals even consent? Was bestiality a deliberate sin or a consequence of madness? These questions open a window into medieval attempts to understand desire and responsibility, often through the lens of theology rather than psychology. Here's a quirky fringe fact. There were rumours of animal lovers attending secret nocturnal sabbaths, where shape-shifting and forbidden acts were said to occur. These stories, often linked to witchcraft accusations, blurred the lines between human and beast in ways that fueled paranoia. Did anyone really believe it? Scholars still debate, but the belief itself had deadly consequences. And of course, this ties into broader anxieties about sexuality and purity. Medieval people worried constantly about the correct order of sex. Who, with whom, how, and why. Bestiality was the ultimate violation, an abomination that demanded public punishment to reassure society that God's law still held sway. You might wonder if these fears influenced everyday life. Did farmers avoid certain animals? Did children grow up hearing tales warning against fooling with beasts? Probably. The boundaries of acceptable desire were policed not just by courts but by stories, sermons and communal shaming. It's a stark reminder. Medieval sexuality wasn't just about love or lust. It was about power, control, and fear. The rules were strict, but the policing of those rules could be brutal and often arbitrary. And sometimes the scariest sins were the ones you didn't expect. You shake off the uneasy feeling and move on, the chickens clucking behind you. But the barnyard's whispers linger, a reminder that in medieval Europe, the line between human and animal desire was one of the most fiercely guarded and most feared boundaries of all. The night is cold and strange as you lay down, and before sleep pulls you under, a peculiar sensation washes over you. You dream you're flying, soaring over fields and forests, naked, free, and inexplicably heading toward a dark gathering deep in the woods. It's a Sabbath, they say, a witches' meeting where women dance with demons, seduced by succubi and incubi who drain their life and fertility. You wake up gasping, heart pounding, sure that something unholy visited you. Welcome to the wild world of medieval witchcraft and its twisted, sex-filled mythology. In medieval Europe, the concept of witches wasn't just about women stirring cauldrons or casting curses. It was deeply entwined with sexual fears, anxieties, and fantasies. The idea of night flights and Sabbath gatherings was common, and the stories often featured erotic elements that terrified and titillated the public. Women accused of witchcraft were thought to have had illicit sexual encounters with demons, creatures who both seduced and destroyed them. These encounters were seen as both the source of their powers and their damnation. The Church's official doctrine portrayed witches as heretics who betrayed God through these perverse acts. But the folklore, the confessions extracted under torture, and the popular imagination painted vivid pictures, witches flying naked through the sky, engaging in wild orgies, and exchanging bodily fluids with their demonic lovers. It was a realm where sexuality was both feared and fetishized. You might think this sounds like pure superstition, and it was. But it wasn't harmless. Accusations of sexual misconduct with demons were a key part of witch trials, leading to arrests, torture, and executions. The terrifying narrative was that these women willingly abandoned human relationships for demonic ones, exchanging their souls for carnal pleasures. The Church used this to justify brutal repression. Here's a historical fact. One of the earliest and most influential witch-hunting manuals, the Malleus Maleficarum, Hammer of Witches, published in 1487, devoted significant attention to the sexual crimes of witches. It described how demons would assault women's bodies, how women would participate in nocturnal meetings, and how these acts were the root of their power and sin. The manual helped fuel centuries of witch hunts across Europe. But scholars still debate whether common people truly believed these stories, or whether the confessions were mostly products of torture and coercion. Some argue that the sexualized images of witchcraft were as much propaganda as reality, designed to demonize women's sexuality and justify their persecution. Others point out that these narratives reflected genuine fears about uncontrollable female desire and social upheaval. A quirky fringe fact: some medieval accounts claimed that witches could change shape or transform into animals, often black cats or hares, allowing them to escape detection or carry out their mischief. The idea of shape-shifting tied into broader anxieties about boundaries between human and animal, man and woman, sacred and profane. This fear of female sexuality being dangerous, uncontrollable, and linked to evil powers had deep roots. It was part of a larger medieval anxiety about maintaining social order and religious purity. Women's bodies were battlegrounds, not just for their own virtue but for the community's spiritual health. But amid the terror, some women may have found ways to reclaim power, through healing, herbalism, or defying norms. Sadly, many paid with their lives. You pull the blankets tighter, the images of night flights lingering like a shadow in your mind. In medieval Europe, sex wasn't just private, it was a battlefield of fear, power, and myth. And sometimes, the most dangerous sins were the ones dreamed in the dark. You pull your cloak tighter against the chill as you make your way through the narrow, winding streets of a bustling medieval town. Lanterns flicker in the fog, and somewhere, laughter spills out of a tavern door. Tonight, though, your mind is on something a little less straightforward, because here, in these cramped alleys and shadowed corners, the boundaries of gender and desire are bending in ways you wouldn't expect. Cross-dressing, role-play, and unexpected desires are weaving their own secret stories beneath the surface of medieval Europe. You might assume the Middle Ages were a time of rigid gender roles. Men fight, women sew, everyone knows their place. But history has a way of complicating our assumptions. People have always found ways to push, blur, or outright break the lines society draws. In some medieval records, we find men dressing as women and women dressing as men, not just for festivals or theatre, but sometimes for survival, love, or rebellion. Imagine a woman donning men's clothes to gain access to education, work, or to escape an abusive marriage, or a man dressing as a woman to perform on stage or navigate a world where his identity didn't fit the binary boxes. These acts were risky. The law frowned on cross-dressing, often punishing it as a form of deceit or moral corruption. Yet the practice persisted, sometimes openly during festivals, other times hidden. One famous example is the medieval figure of Joan of Arc, who wore male armour and clothing as a practical and symbolic choice, and was ultimately condemned in part because of it. Her story highlights how gender presentation could carry enormous social and political weight. And then there's the quieter, less famous stories. The female husbands recorded in court cases, women who married other women, living openly as men. Some of these cases ended in scandal and trial, others in sympathy or secret acceptance. Historians debate how common these were, but they reveal a surprising spectrum of medieval sexuality and gender expression. Here's a quirky historical fact. In some guilds and religious festivals, cross-dressing was an accepted and even celebrated part of the ritual calendar. On days like the Feast of Fools, social hierarchies flipped, and gender roles were playfully reversed. People wore masks, swapped clothes, and parodied authority. These moments allowed a release valve for societal tension, and a glimpse into the fluidity underlying rigid norms. But outside festivals, the consequences could be severe. Laws against cross-dressing often linked it to sexual immorality, heresy, or fraud. It was seen as a threat to the divine order. Theologians wrote extensively on the dangers of gender confusion, warning that it led to lust, deception, and chaos. Yet, the reality on the ground was messier. People lived, loved, and expressed themselves in ways that defied easy classification. This leads to one of the big debates among scholars today. How do we interpret these behaviours? Were they expressions of transgender identity, queer desire, or purely practical disguises? Medieval people didn't have our modern language for gender and sexuality, so any interpretation is a bit like assembling a puzzle with missing pieces. Some argue for continuity with today's experiences. Others caution against projecting modern categories onto the past. There's even evidence of same-sex relationships coded in literature and legal records, often hidden under layers of euphemism and metaphor. Secret communities existed, connected by discrete signals, coded language, and shared spaces. Desire found a way, even in times of repression. You pause in the misty street, watching a pair of actors perform a bawdy play with gender-bending roles. The crowd roars with laughter. For a moment, the rigid world slips, and something freer blooms. In medieval Europe, gender and sexuality weren't fixed. They were fluid, contested, and sometimes surprisingly playful. Behind the stern faces of authority, behind the sermons and laws, people lived their truths in shadow and light, and you wonder, as you walk on, how many stories remain untold, hidden in the folds of fabric, the turn of a phrase, or the flicker of a lantern. You step past a narrow doorway into a world pulsing with noise, heat and scent. A world where desire is traded as openly as bread. The brothel. Welcome to medieval Europe's red light district, a place where sex is business, survival and scandal all rolled into one. Here, madams rule their empires with a mix of shrewdness and grit, their walls echoing with laughter, moans and the clinking of coins. It's not just a den of iniquity, it's a complex, regulated part of urban life. You probably think brothels were underground, illegal and utterly secret. That's only partly true. In many medieval cities, Paris, London, Venice, brothels were licensed by the authorities. Yes, you heard right. They were taxed, policed and integrated into the fabric of city governance. Officials collected fees, ensuring that these houses of pleasure operated openly, kept records, and stayed within certain boundaries. Sex work, while frowned upon morally, was recognised as inevitable. Walking through the crowded streets, you see women of all ages, some forced, many choosing this life, a few somewhere in between. They wear modest dress, blending with the market-goers but always aware of their trade. Madames are formidable women who run the show, negotiating with officials, protecting their girls and managing the flow of customers. They command respect and fear in equal measure. There's a tension here, between control and freedom. Some women gain a kind of power in this world, owning property, building networks, and carving out autonomy rare for medieval women. Others are trapped, victims of debt, violence, or exploitation. The red light district isn't a monolith, it's a shifting, living ecosystem. Historically, the church condemned brothels vehemently. Sermons preached against the devil's houses, and crusades sometimes included raids on these establishments. But pragmatically, city leaders often tolerated them to contain and regulate sexual activity, preventing worse abuses and protecting respectable women from unwanted attention. Here's a quirky historical fact. In some cities, brothels had rules posted, like today's codes of conduct: no fighting, no stealing, and strict hours. Violations could result in fines or expulsion. Some even had sex manuals for workers, advising on hygiene, client relations, and techniques. It was a surprisingly professional operation. And the money? Brothels contributed to city coffers, funding everything from walls to churches. Your taxes, in a way, paid for the right to indulge. It's a delicate balance of sin and survival, but there's also scandal and risk. Disease, especially syphilis in later centuries, spread rapidly. Women could be arrested or whipped for breaking rules or offending clients. Reputation was fragile. Still, some women built careers, even fame, through their trade. The madame's quarters are a swirl of whispered deals, strategy, and fierce loyalty. She's a businesswoman, a protector, and sometimes a mother figure. Her authority is real, often more effective than any law. You overhear a negotiation over a special client, a nobleman seeking discretion and willing to pay handsomely. Deals are struck with quick words and sharper eyes. In this world, silence is golden. There's also a fascinating scholarly debate. Were medieval brothels empowering for women, or did they reinforce patriarchal control? Some argue that brothels provided refuge and income where none existed. Others see them as exploitative, controlling female bodies for male pleasure. The truth is tangled, much like the alleys you just walked. Stepping back into the cool night air, you're struck by the contrast between the vibrant, risky life inside and the strict morality preached outside. Medieval cities lived with this tension every day. Sex here is business, sex here is survival. Sex here is a story of power, resilience, and human complexity. And as you walk away, you carry the echo of laughter and footsteps behind locked doors, reminders that desire, like life, always finds a way. You find yourself in a quiet, candlelit chamber. The scent of beeswax and parchment thick in the air. On the wooden table before you lies a worn manuscript, its pages filled with advice from a learned cleric on how to properly approach the marital act. It's a sex manual from 1272, and the topic at hand is the natural way to make love, a debate as heated then as it still can be today. Here, in the glow of flickering candlelight, you're about to learn that medieval ideas about sex positions were both surprisingly specific and deeply moralistic. First things first, the missionary position is king. Or rather, It's God's preferred position. Church authorities and medical writers alike argued that sex should happen with the man on top, facing the woman, because it mirrored the natural order and ensured conception. Anything else? Unnatural, dangerous, sinful. The medieval mind linked physical posture to spiritual and social order. Deviation was seen as rebellion against divine law. Imagine the frustration of medieval couples who wanted a little variety. Some dared to experiment, but not without fear. Sexual acts against nature, which included anal sex, oral sex, and certain exotic positions, were condemned by theologians and could even lead to severe penance. The Church saw these acts as mortal sins, threatening both the soul and the social fabric. Medical texts of the time often intertwined with theology. Physicians warned that unnatural positions could harm the body, cause sterility, disease, or madness. These warnings, though sometimes based on shaky science, reinforced the moral message. The body was a sacred temple and sex a ritual to be performed correctly. Here's a historical fact. The Ars Amatoria, a medieval love guide inspired by classical texts, suggested that the right timing and position were essential for conception. It even advised that couples should avoid having sex on holy days or during menstruation, which was considered unclean. The manual also hinted at positions that supposedly increased fertility, but always within the bounds of acceptability. But not everyone agreed. Folk traditions often celebrated different practices, some of which contradicted church teachings. There's evidence that rural couples used more creative approaches, relying on herbal aphrodisiacs, charms, and alternative positions believed to bring luck or ensure healthy children. These practices lived in the shadows of official doctrine, but persisted nonetheless. A quirky fringe fact. Some medieval medical manuscripts included explicit illustrations of couples in various positions, sometimes with humorous captions or exaggerated expressions. These images, rare but provocative, suggest that curiosity about pleasure wasn't entirely suppressed, just carefully coded. The debate over natural sex positions also reveals broader tensions between control and desire, between doctrine and reality. Sex wasn't just about reproduction, it was about power, obedience, and identity. By policing how couples made love, authorities aimed to shape not just bodies but entire societies. You pause, imagining the awkwardness of medieval newlyweds, fumbling in the dark, guided by manuals written by monks who had never touched a woman. The fear of sin mingled with the hope of creating life, all under the watchful eyes of God and community. So the next time you hear missionary position, remember, it's not just a modern cliché, it's a centuries-old prescription for divine order and social harmony. And yet, behind closed doors, human nature had its own agenda. The heavy wooden door creaks as you step into the convent courtyard, the scent of garden herbs mingling with candle wax and ancient stone. You're supposed to find silence here, a place of devotion, prayer, and strict chastity. But behind those thick walls, where veils and habits conceal faces, the reality is far more complex. The nuns? They're not just pious angels. Sometimes they're quite wild. Welcome to the surprising, occasionally scandalous secret life behind convent walls. You've heard that convents were strict, disciplined places where women lived in total celibacy, dedicating themselves wholly to God. And for many, that was true. But human nature doesn't vanish just because you take vows, and the sheer number of women crammed into limited spaces, cut off from the outside world, created a pressure cooker of emotion, desire, and rebellion. There are stories, some whispered, some recorded, of nuns who formed intense emotional and even sexual relationships with one another. These bonds weren't always condemned outright. Sometimes they were seen as spiritual friendships, intense attachments that transcended the physical, but could also include physical affection. Other times, they were scandals, punishable by penance or exile. The Church officially condemned sexual activity in convents, understandably, but enforcement varied wildly. Some abbesses turned a blind eye, others cracked down with brutal severity. Punishments ranged from public penance to imprisonment. Yet despite the risks, evidence suggests that convent life didn't guarantee absolute chastity. One of the more infamous cases comes from the 13th century, involving a nun accused of having a secret lover, another woman. The scandal rocked the abbey, leading to trials and investigations. Letters and confessions from convents reveal that such relationships, while risky, were not unheard of. The closed environment fostered intimacy and, sometimes, secrecy. Here's a quirky fact. Medieval medical texts sometimes advise nuns on how to suppress dangerous desires, recommending fasting, prayer, and cold baths. Some convents even employed midwives or physicians to help with hysteria, a catch-all diagnosis often linked to female sexuality and emotional excess. Beyond lesbian relationships, convents also housed women struggling with their vows. Some nuns secretly gave birth, others ran away to marry or rejoin secular life. The tension between religious duty and personal desire was constant. But not all convents were alike. Some were centres of learning and culture, where women had access to books, education, and relative autonomy. Others were little more than prisons for unwanted daughters. The sexual dynamics varied accordingly. This brings us to a fascinating scholarly debate. How should we understand sexuality in convents? Were these relationships acts of rebellion, survival, or genuine affection? Did convents provide a rare space for female sexuality to exist outside male control, or did they reinforce patriarchal repression in a different guise? The answers are as layered as the veils worn by the nuns themselves. Imagine the loneliness of a young woman locked away from the world, finding solace in another's touch, navigating the fine line between sin and salvation. The convent was both sanctuary and cage. As you walk past the cloistered gardens, you hear soft laughter, too light, too human to be prayer. Behind those walls, life pulses, desires simmer, and sometimes, just sometimes, the chastity veil slips. You're seated at a rough wooden table in a dimly lit apothecary's shop, the air thick with the pungent aromas of crushed herbs, honey, and something faintly musky you can't quite place. The apothecary, a wiry woman with sharp eyes, hands you a small vial filled with a greenish liquid and whispers, "Drink this before you meet your beloved tonight. Welcome to the fascinating, fragrant, and sometimes utterly baffling world of medieval love potions, aphrodisiacs, and sex magic." Medieval Europe had a complex relationship with the idea that certain foods, herbs, and concoctions could ignite passion, enhance fertility, or even control desire. The apothecaries and folk healers who brewed these potions occupied a liminal space. Part medical practitioner, part mystic, part confidence artist. Some remedies were rooted in botanical knowledge passed down through generations. Others blended superstition, astrology, and outright fantasy. The classics of medieval love magic often involved ingredients like mandrake root, famous for its screaming when pulled from the earth, powdered pearls, rose petals, and even bits of snakeskin. Recipes might call for precise timing, mixing under a full moon or during a specific planetary alignment. The goal? To create a potion that could inspire love, attract a desired partner, or spark uncontrollable lust. Here's a historical fact. One popular aphrodisiac was Venus's wine, a mixture of herbs and spices believed to invoke the goddess of love herself. Medieval texts also mention love cakes infused with herbs said to kindle desire. These treats were often exchanged between lovers, sometimes as secret tokens or playful gifts. But the line between helpful potion and dangerous magic was thin. The Church condemned many of these practices as witchcraft or heresy. Women accused of brewing love potions risked accusations of using maleficium, harmful magic. Some were persecuted, others simply scorned or dismissed as foolish. Yet the allure of these remedies never faded. The use of love potions also intersected with broader medieval beliefs about the body and humours. If passion was cold or blocked, a potion could warm the blood or loosen the spirits. Conversely, too much desire was seen as dangerous and needed to be controlled. Potions thus played a dual role, both kindling and calming desire depending on the need. Here's a quirky fringe fact. Some medieval recipes involved truly bizarre ingredients, like powdered crushed beetles, dragon's blood resin, not actual dragon blood sadly, and even the ashes of burned love letters. These ingredients reveal the blending of natural and supernatural beliefs. There's also a fascinating debate among scholars. Were these potions mainly symbolic gestures, psychological aids, or actual physical remedies? Some argue that the placebo effect was strong, believing in the potion's power could boost confidence and attraction. Others emphasized the real pharmacological effects of certain herbs, which could influence mood and libido. You imagine sipping the potion, the bitter taste lingering as hope and anticipation rise. Does it work? Maybe. Or maybe the real magic is the belief itself, the shared secret, the trust, the thrill of desire made tangible. In a world where open discussions of sex were taboo, these potions offered a way to navigate love's mysteries, an alchemical bridge between the spiritual and the carnal. As you leave the shop, the vial tucked safely in your cloak, you can't help but wonder, is love a matter of the heart, the body, or just a little bit of magic? You slip behind the heavy velvet drapes of the royal chamber, the soft glow of candlelight dancing on tapestries depicting distant battles and courtly banquets. The air smells of lavender, cedarwood, and something faintly spicy, perfume perhaps, or the residue of whispered secrets. This is where the sex lives of kings and queens unfold, far from the prying eyes of commoners and chroniclers. And trust me, behind those gilded walls, things get far messier and far more fascinating than the dry histories you're used to. Royal sex wasn't just about pleasure, it was power, diplomacy, and survival wrapped in silk sheets. The primary goal? Producing heirs. Legitimate, healthy heirs to secure dynasties, inheritances, and alliances. Failure to do so wasn't merely personal, it was political suicide. Queens were scrutinised for their fertility like athletes before the big race. Kings, too, were expected to demonstrate vigour, sometimes with a court physician at the ready to assess performance and potency. But royal bedrooms were anything but private. Servants, ladies-in-waiting, and physicians often played roles in orchestrating the royal duty. Midwives and doctors advised on timing, positions, and even the diet of the royal couple to boost fertility. In some courts, the king's sexual encounters were scheduled like military campaigns, with strategic precision. You might think such a setup would kill romance, but surprisingly courtly love and politics often intertwined. Kings and queens exchanged letters full of coded passion, poetry and longing, even if actual encounters were brief and functional. Some monarchs indulged in affairs, others remained strictly devoted, and jealousy. That was a royal sport of its own. Here's a historical fact. Henry VIII famously struggled with producing a male heir, his marriages and mistresses sparking one of England's most tumultuous political upheavals, the English Reformation. Behind his grand palaces, bedroom politics changed the course of history. Royal sex also had bizarre rituals. For instance, in some courts, a marriage bed ceremony was public, with witnesses ensuring the consummation of the marriage. In other cases, blankets stained with blood were displayed as proof of virginity, echoing the peasant traditions but on a much grander stage. A quirky fringe fact. Some monarchs used exotic aphrodisiacs, from powdered pearls to powdered gold, to ensure virility and desire. Others believed in the power of talismans or wore special rings to boost potency. The royal bedroom was a blend of superstition, medicine, and politics. There's an ongoing scholarly debate. How much agency did queens really have? Were they active participants in their sexual and political lives, or pawns in a male-dominated game? Letters and diaries suggest a spectrum. Some queens were cunning players, while others were victims of circumstance. Imagine the pressure, knowing every night might decide a kingdom's fate, every touch weighed against the future of a dynasty. The royal bed was both throne and battlefield. So next time you think medieval sex was simple or repressed, remember the intricate dance of power, desire, and duty played out behind palace walls, where history's greatest dramas unfolded not just on the battlefield, but under the covers. You slip quietly through a shadowed alley, heart pounding, every glance over your shoulder a calculated risk. The world outside is loud and public, but here, hidden in the folds of medieval cities, a secret language hums, a code of glances, gestures, and whispered words that connect people whose desires society demands they hide. This is the clandestine life of queer love in medieval Europe, where same-sex desire existed but rarely dared to breathe in the open air. Same-sex relationships in the Middle Ages were dangerous, yes. The Church condemned sodomy as a grave sin, punishable by excommunication, imprisonment, or death. Laws varied across regions, but the threat of brutal penalties loomed large. Yet human desire is stubborn, and queer people found ways to love, to connect, and sometimes to resist. The challenge was language. Medieval Europe had no modern vocabulary for gay or lesbian. Instead, people described actions, sins against nature, or unnatural acts, without much nuance about identity or affection. But that doesn't mean those desires were invisible. They were encoded in literature, art, and everyday life in ways subtle and sometimes bold. One famous example is the Carmina Burana, a collection of poems from the 12th and 13th centuries, which includes playful, bawdy verses celebrating same-sex desire among both men and women. These works reveal a world where queer love could be both mocked and cherished, a paradox of marginalization and celebration. Some scholars argue that monastic life itself created spaces where same-sex affection flourished, whether emotional or physical, within the strict confines of celibacy. Letters between monks sometimes express deep love and longing, challenging modern assumptions about medieval sexuality. You might be surprised to learn that some towns had secret meeting places or rituals where queer people gathered, disguised as festivals, religious events, or guild meetings. These were lifelines, spaces where coded signals like particular flowers, colours, or accessories announced identity and intent without words. Here's a quirky historical fact. In parts of medieval France, certain stones called love stones were said to have magical powers to attract same-sex lovers. Pilgrims would seek them out, hoping to find companionship or passion in a world that condemned their love. The risk was real. Confessions recorded in church archives reveal terrifying tales of betrayal, torture, and execution. But they also show a resilience, a refusal to erase desire, a persistence of love even in the face of persecution. There's an ongoing debate among historians. To what extent were medieval queer communities organised or simply underground? Were expressions of same-sex desire private, or did they form recognised subcultures? The answers remain elusive, but the evidence points to a complex hidden tapestry of lives lived in shadow and light. You pause under a flickering lantern, wondering about the courage it took to love in secret, to hold a hand, share a smile, risk everything for a touch. In medieval Europe, queer desire was not absent. It was alive, coded, whispered, and fought for. And though the risks were great, so too was the human need for connection. The candle flickers weakly as you sit in a cramped chamber with a medieval physician, a man who smells faintly of herbs and sweat. You've come because you're worried. Worried about a rash, a burning sensation, or the swelling that won't go away. In this time before germ theory or antibiotics, diseases of the groin are terrifying mysteries. Welcome to the perilous world of medieval venereal diseases, where doctors did their best to diagnose and treat what they barely understood, and where sex could be deadly. You probably think medieval people didn't know about sexually transmitted infections, STIs. That's not entirely true. They recognized symptoms, sores, ulcers, painful urination, and they knew these afflictions were linked to sexual contact. But their explanations were a jumble of humours, divine punishment, and bad luck. Doctors attributed diseases to corrupted blood, imbalanced humours, or even the stars. Medical texts warned against promiscuity, but also offered remedies ranging from herbal salves to painful cauterization. Syphilis, the notorious French disease, first appeared in Europe in the late 15th century, but before that other STIs circulated, often unnamed or confused with other ailments. The symptoms could be horrific: flesh rotting away, disfigurement, and eventual death. And the stigma? Crushing. People with these diseases were often shunned, blamed, or imprisoned. Here's a historical fact. Medieval physicians sometimes used urine analysis as a diagnostic tool, examining colour, smell, and consistency to guess the illness. They might also look at the pulse, ask about dreams, and check for humour imbalances before prescribing treatments that included purging, bloodletting, or herbal concoctions. But treatments were often worse than the disease. The use of mercury, for example, was common for syphilis later on, a toxic metal that could cause severe side effects. Medieval remedies also included poultices made from animal parts, dung, or bizarre herbal mixtures. There's a quirky fringe fact. Some texts recommended bathing in rosewater or wearing amulets to ward off infection. while others suggested sexual abstinence during certain lunar phases to prevent catching disease. The blend of superstition and early medicine is a reminder how people clung to hope in the face of ignorance. The fear of disease influenced sexual behaviour, at least in theory. Some religious leaders preached abstinence as the only sure prevention. Condoms made of linen or animal intestines existed but were rare, and mostly used to prevent pregnancy rather than disease. The stigma around venereal disease also fed into social control. Women, especially sex workers, were often blamed as vectors, reinforcing dangerous stereotypes and justifying harsh punishments. Men's roles were less scrutinised, revealing gendered double standards. Medieval cities sometimes set up quarantine areas for the infected, but knowledge of transmission was limited. People relied on prayers, pilgrimages, and folk remedies more than science. Scholars debate how widespread STIs really were in medieval Europe, and how much they shaped sexual norms. Some argue fear of disease limited promiscuity. Others suggest it had little effect on human desire. You leave the chamber, relieved for now, but aware of the shadow hanging over every touch, every encounter. In medieval Europe, sex was not just pleasure or duty. It was a gamble with your body, your health, and your future. You're standing on a dusty camp outside a castle, the clang of armour and the smell of sweat heavy in the air. Around you, knights prepare for battle, faces hardened, hearts steeled. They swear oaths of celibacy before going on crusade, promising to purify their souls through sacrifice. But the reality? A lot messier. Celibate knights, more like knights with needs and no easy outlets. Welcome to the complicated, sometimes scandalous sex lives of medieval warriors. The idea of the celibate knight is powerful, a holy warrior devoted to God, chastity, and martial glory. Yet historians have uncovered a trove of letters, confessions, and anecdotal stories revealing that many knights did not adhere strictly to celibacy vows. They engaged in affairs with camp followers, prostitutes, or local women, sometimes openly, sometimes in secret. Camp followers, women who travelled with armies, provided food, laundry, nursing, and yes, companionship. They were a vital part of military life. The church officially disapproved but tolerated their presence, recognising the practical realities of long campaigns. Knights often sought these women's company to relieve stress and loneliness. Confession records reveal that knights grappled with guilt over sexual sins, sometimes confessing to multiple encounters during campaigns. The line between spiritual ideals and bodily desires blurred in the muddy fields far from home. Here's a historical fact. The De l'Ode Novae Militia, in praise of the new knighthood, by St. Bernard of Clairvaux, a key spiritual guide for crusaders, condemned sexual activity during crusades, urging knights to maintain purity. Yet letters from crusading knights tell of bawdy songs, romantic liaisons, and broken vows. And it wasn't just sex. Homosexual acts, often harshly punished, occurred within military camps. Scholars debate how common these were, but records of accusations and trials attest to their presence. The intense male environment fostered both camaraderie and tensions related to sexuality. There's a quirky fringe fact. Some crusaders carried love tokens, embroidered handkerchiefs, rings, or written vows, from women back home or camp followers. These tokens were prized reminders of affection and humanity amid the violence. The tension between knightly ideals and earthly desires creates a vivid picture of medieval masculinity, both heroic and flawed. Knights aspired to holiness, but were human, with all the complexities that entails. Imagine a weary knight far from home, torn between vows and yearning, morality and survival. The campfires glow as tales of valour mix with whispered secrets. Celibate knights, rarely. Men with needs, always. And in the dusty aftermath of battle, these contradictions lived on, in letters, in confessions, and in the quiet moments beneath the stars. You find yourself standing in the public square, eyes fixed on a wooden platform draped with coarse cloth, surrounded by a crowd buzzing with anticipation. Today's spectacle, a public penance for a couple caught in an illicit affair. The air is thick with whispers, judgment, and the faint scent of wood smoke. Medieval Europe wasn't shy about shaming those who strayed from sexual norms. Punishments were public, painful, and designed to humiliate. Welcome to the harsh world of medieval sexual justice. Sexual transgressions, adultery, fornication, incest, were not just moral failings, they were crimes with social consequences. The church and secular courts often worked hand in hand to enforce sexual discipline. When scandal broke, the guilty parties might be dragged to the town square, stripped of dignity, and subjected to humiliations designed to deter others. One common punishment was the charivari, a raucous public shaming involving noise-making, mock trials, and sometimes physical abuse. Adulterers could be paraded with signs declaring their sin, forced to wear humiliating clothing, or made to perform acts of contrition before the whole town. In extreme cases, sexual sins led to whipping, branding, or even execution. The stakes were high, especially for women whose reputations were tightly policed. Accused women might be locked in stocks, had their heads shaved, or been banished. Men faced punishment too, but often less severe, a reflection of gendered double standards. Here's a historical fact. In some regions, penitential theatres reenacted sinful acts as a form of public correction, blending morality play with real-life justice. These performances reinforced community norms, mixing entertainment with discipline. The confessional also played a role. Some sinners were given public penance, pilgrimages, wearing special garments, or carrying crosses to demonstrate repentance. The goal was not only punishment but reintegration into the community, but public shaming could backfire. Gossip and rumour sometimes strengthened bonds between the punished and marginalised groups, and some transgressors used penance as a chance for redemption, becoming examples of moral renewal. There's a quirky fringe fact. Some towns employed sin catchers, officials who investigated rumours of sexual misbehaviour, acting as early moral police. These figures could wield significant power, often sparking fear and resentment. The line between sin and crime was blurry. Sexual behaviour was deeply entwined with social order, honour, and power. Punishment was as much about control as morality. You watch the couple kneel, faces flushed with shame, voices barely audible as they confess before the crowd. Their story becomes a warning etched into communal memory. In medieval Europe, sex could condemn or redeem, and the public square was the stage where society's values played out in full view. The night air is cool, but your skin prickles with unease. As you drift into sleep, the boundary between dreams and reality begins to blur. Suddenly, you're pulled into a vivid vision, shadowy figures dancing around a fire, their faces shifting between human and demonic. You feel hands on your body, cold and insistent as succubi and incubi haunt your slumber. Welcome to the medieval world of sexual dreamscapes and demon lovers, where nocturnal emissions were fraught with spiritual terror and erotic mystery. Medieval people took dreams seriously, especially those involving sex. Dreams were seen as messages from God, the devil, or the soul itself. Nightmares featuring demons seducing sleepers were considered dangerous signs, proof that the devil was preying on the vulnerable, seeking to corrupt their souls through lustful assault. The concept of succubi, female demons, and incubi, male demons, was widespread. These spirits were believed to visit sleeping humans, draining their vitality and leading them into sin. Men who woke with erections or wet dreams feared they'd been violated by these supernatural beings. Women, especially unmarried ones, feared nocturnal assaults that could result in pregnancy or spiritual contamination. Here's a historical fact. Theologians debated whether nocturnal emissions required confession or penance. Some saw them as involuntary and therefore not sinful. Others warned that repeated dream sins indicated spiritual weakness. Manuals for confessors included instructions on how to counsel penitents troubled by such experiences. This fear fueled strange medical and religious remedies. People slept with prayers, charms, or holy relics under their pillows. Some priests performed exorcisms to rid individuals of demonic influence. Herbal baths and special diets were prescribed to calm the body and spirit. A quirky fringe fact. Some medieval bestiaries described animals thought to be connected with these demons. Owls, bats, and wolves, creatures of the night symbolizing mystery and danger. People believed avoiding these animals at night could ward off attacks. Dreams also inspired art and literature, often blurring the line between erotic fantasy and moral warning. The Hypnerotomachia Polyphale, a famous Renaissance dream allegory, drew heavily on medieval ideas about desire, sin, and the supernatural. There's a scholarly debate about how seriously common people took these beliefs, versus how much they reflected elite anxieties. Some argue that demon seduction stories were a way to explain and control natural sexual urges that society repressed. Others see them as genuine spiritual fears. For you lying awake in the darkness, the knowledge that desire could be both a human need and a spiritual battleground adds a layer of complexity to the medieval mind. Nocturnal sins, demon lovers, and erotic dreams were part of a culture where sexuality was never just physical. It was deeply intertwined with faith, fear, and the quest for salvation. As dawn breaks, you wonder, did anyone really rest easy in the arms of sleep? You step quietly through the heavy velvet curtains into a room filled with warmth, candlelight flickering softly against tapestries that have witnessed centuries of whispered secrets. You've made it through the tangled web of medieval sexuality, through fear, desire, repression, rebellion, and the endless dance between flesh and spirit. Now it's time to breathe it all in, to reflect on what you've seen, and to understand what it really meant to live and love in medieval Europe. The medieval world you've explored was paradoxical, messy, and deeply human. Sex wasn't just about pleasure or procreation. It was power, survival, shame, rebellion, and sometimes, surprisingly, joy. The Church's voice was loud and often harsh, insisting on chastity, purity, and order. But underneath that authority was a reality of desire that no decree could fully suppress. You've witnessed the harshness of virginity tests and public penance, but also the tender, secret moments shared in cloistered convents or whispered in the dim corners of bathhouses. You've seen how love could be ritualized into courtly longing or reduced to a transactional necessity in brothels. You've peered behind royal doors to see dynasties born from political necessity and royal passions entwined with duty. Medieval sexuality was never simple. It was shaped by fear of damnation, but also by the resilience of human longing. The strictures of society created space for rebellion, whether through bawdy marginalia, cross-dressing trickery, or forbidden loves whispered in secret. Desire found a way, even when it had to hide in the shadows. Here's a final quirky fact. Despite all the rules, restrictions, and sermons, medieval people wrote thousands of poems, songs, and stories celebrating love and lust in all their forms. They laughed, cried, ached, and dreamed, just like us. The debates you've encountered, from the nature of sin to the reality of queer lives, remind us that history is never black and white. It's a tapestry of contradictions, where faith and flesh, power and passion, fear and freedom are forever intertwined. So, as you close your eyes tonight, remember this. Medieval Europe was not a time of repression alone. It was a world of complex, rich, and deeply human experiences, where love, lust, and desire beat beneath the surface, resilient and alive. Thank you for joining this journey through a past that still speaks to us today. Sweet dreams.